My name's Rebecca West, and I'm a retired professor. I've taught here for 40 years and retired in 2013, but I still like to come back from time to time and see students and audiences like this. And so today I'll be talking to you about Venice, however, a dark Venice. Queen of the Adriatic, Serenissima, city of bridges, city of canals, Italy's honeymoon destination of choice. All of these designate Venice, known as a lushly romantic floating dream of gliding gondolas and quaint traffic-free streets and squares through which to meander as a happily carefree tourist. No other city, at least in the West, conjures up such lovely visions, both for real travelers and for armchair travelers who've read about and seen innumerable images of the glittering city built on water. Today's Venice is no longer the same alluring sight of quiet meandering it once was, alas, for rampant tourism and huge cruise ships, not to speak of extreme high waters, pollution, and other factors, have threatened its very existence and eroded its beauty. Jennifer Scapatone, who is a colleague in the English department here, who works on modern and contemporary Italian topics about, among other things, wrote a book called Killing the Moonlight, Modernism in Venice, in which she says that according to research commissions formed after the disastrous floods of 1966, quote, radical changes in water levels were caused not by nature, but by modern man, not by climatic conditions intrinsic to the lagoon, but by pollution, dumping, farming, and industry at the city's periphery, end of quote. She then continues, quote, the escalating reality of Venice's vulnerability gradually exposed the fallacy of the city's romantic mythos. It was not isolated from the conditions and costs of modernity, end of quote. Yet, we know that swarms of tourists continue today to be lured by the aura of the Venice of yore and its association with Venus, the goddess of love, with Casanova, with the ritual of carnival. And this myth persists even in the face of new and troubling realities. One of the movies that introduced the mythic Venice to post-war American audiences was Summertime, starring Katharine Hepburn as a frustrated, bottled-up spinster of 50 who finds sexual rapture, romantic fulfillment in her own heretofore hidden, soft and feminine side on a vacation in Venice, in the arms of a graying Latin lover played by Rossano Brazzi. The poster for this film gave equal billing to Hepburn and Venice, exclaiming, Hepburn as you've never seen her, Venice as you've never seen it. And in fact, the film functions very much, not only as what we would call a chick flick today, but also as a travelogue, brazenly highlighting the many joys of Venice, including lounging in a gondola on the Grand Canal, shopping for old glass, drinking aperitifs in the Piazza San Marco amidst the darling pigeons. The romantic myth of those post-war years persists even today, even in our increasingly demythologized age. Many writers, filmmakers, painters, and other creative individuals have over the centuries contributed to the mythic view of Venice as utterly romantic and enchanting. I need not list names or works. We have only to think of paintings by Canaletto or Turner to recall to the mind's eye a gorgeous city of soft, alluring contours, evanescent, watery vistas, pastel colors. Yet, some writers have captured a different Venice, one that's dark, dangerous, even macabre, a little bit creepy. Of course, the city has always projected a certain mysterious quality, allied to shadowy night gondola rides, hidden labyrinthic streets off the beaten path, and especially the festivals of Carnival with its masked figures and often dangerous excesses. By the way, just as a little side note, Turin is officially the city explicitly linked to the creepy. It's touted as one of the geographically determined sites of white magic along with Lyon and Prague, and of black magic along with London and San Francisco. And you can take magic tours in Turin, guaranteed to elicit a shiver or two, or not, but fun in any case. But unlike Turin's explicit tie with magic, both white and black, Venice's creepy aspect has more to do with its quality of decadence, eroticism in the form of sex and death allied, and the exceptionality of its watery essence as contrasted with cities dominated by the solidity of land. In the collective unconscious, it's a thoroughly feminine city, allied with the historically dominant feminine traits of liquidity, mysterious contours, and secrets. There are many writers I could have chosen for this talk, including some I'm sure you've all read or certainly have heard about, such as Donna Leon, who sets all of her Inspector Brunetti stories in Venice, or another mystery writer, Michael Dibdin, and Wilkie Collins wrote a book called The Haunted Hotel, A Mystery of Modern Venice. And of course, Casanova has a lot to say about Venice in his memoirs. And there's a wonderfully entertaining book by the postmodern writer Robert Coover called Pinocchio in Venice. But to my mind, the narratives I chose for today's talk are among the very best examples of stories that give us a dark and troubling Venice. What links these stories is their emphasis on death, desire, obsession, and loss. What better place to begin then than with Thomas Mann's novella Death in Venice, published in German in 1912 and in English for the first time in 1924. Then from Mann, I will move on to Don't Look Now, a story by Daphne du Maurier of Rebecca fame. Then to Ian McEwan's novel, The Comfort of Strangers. And finally, to Patricia Highsmith's novel, Those Who Walk Away. 3 of these books or tales have been adapted to cinema very successfully, and I'll just say a few very brief words about those movies, since time did not allow me to do both books and movies. So to Thomas Mann's classic that most of us have no doubt read at one time or another. It's the story of Gustav von Aschenbach, a highly successful writer who lives an extremely ascetic widower's life, dedicated as he is to the Apollonian ideal of control and purified intellect. As the story opens, we meet Aschenbach, who, after the first of a series of casual encounters with a red-haired man near the cemetery where Aschenbach had been waiting for a bus. And by the way, this is a man who projects hostility in some troubling way. Aschenbach is seized with a passionate desire to travel, quote, a youthfully ardent thirst for distant scenes. And he experiences a kind of hallucination in which, quote, desire projected itself visually. And he sees a tropical place, a kind of primeval wilderness, and he even sees the eyes of a tiger glimmering through the jungle foliage. The Dionysian side rears up with great force, and Aschenbach feels an urgent need to escape from his carefully ordered life. He first goes to a city on a peninsula in the Adriatic on the Istrian coast, and this is probably the Croatian city of Pula. It's not named in the story. But he soon realizes that it is Venice that he wants, quote, but of course, when one wanted to arrive overnight at the incomparable, the fabulous, the like nothing else in the world, where was it one went? Why, obviously, he had intended to go there. Whatever was he doing here? A blunder. 10 days after his arrival on the island, a swift motorboat bore him and his luggage in the misty dawning back across the water to the naval station, where he landed only to pass over the landing stage and onto the wet decks of a ship, lying there with steam up for the passage to Venice, end of quote. But there's something fated about his travel to Venice, as if only that city could fulfill his strongest desires. Yet there's something already amiss and foreboding about the trip he's undertaking. The ship, for example, that he takes to get from Pula to Venice is an ancient hulk, quote, obsolete, dingy, grimed with soot. A dirty hunchback sailor escorts him to a man with a beard like a goat's. And goats, of course, are often allied with some devilish associations. And this is the fellow who writes him a ticket to Venice. He's reminded of a circus director, and the man's comments about Venice are totally overblown and empty. He exclaims, "Ah, Venice, what a glorious city, irresistibly attracted to the cultured man for her past history as well as her present charm." The next disturbing element is in the form of an old man on the ship who's with a group of youths. The old man is wearing rouge and a wig, dyed mustaches, and yellowish false teeth. Yet he's the most boisterous of all in his group, and the young men with him seem to accept him as one of them. Aschenbach is appalled, and he feels, quote, not quite canny, as though the world were suffering a dreamlike distortion of perspective, which he might arrest by shutting it all out for a few minutes, end of quote. And indeed, there is something uncanny about this approach to what was presumably his dream city. There's something creepy and off. The old man is, of course, a foreshadowing of Aschenbach's own fate near the end of the story. As the boat proceeds, it begins to rain. All sense of time and space is lost in the, quote, vast plains of empty sea. I quoted heavily from this episode of Arrival because it establishes right away the strange, disturbing atmosphere that envelops Aschenbach's arrival to his so desired goal, the city of Venice. Nor does the feeling of distortion dissipate as the boat arrives, for the old man comes back into sight and he's now pitiably drunk, yet he continues to giggle, leer, and make a spectacle of himself. Aschenbach experiences once more, quote, a dazed sense, as though things about him were just slightly losing their ordinary perspective, beginning to show a distortion that might merge into the grotesque. As Aschenbach steps into a gondola, however, he feels a secret thrill, for although the gondola reminds him of a coffin and calls up visions of death, he also thinks to himself that the gondola's passenger chair is, quote, the softest, most luxurious, most relaxing seat in the world, end of quote. The gondolier begins to row him in the wrong direction, however, and is curiously insistent, even in the face of his passengers' protestations. He's another light-haired, ominous figure allied to the fellow near the cemetery, to the old man, and his assertion, "I will row you well," is reminiscent somehow of Kenan, who ferries dead souls across the river Styx. Aschenbach's vacillation between negative and positive sensations and reactions to Venice will continue throughout the story. For every good feeling he has about the city and his stay there, there is a bad feeling that soon surges forth. Venice is beautiful, but it's already colored by the negativity that has insinuated itself into Aschenbach's perceptions. As we remember, everything changes for Aschenbach in Venice when he first sees Tadzio, the perfectly beautiful young Polish boy who will come to obsess him. The boy's face recalls, quote, the noblest moment of Greek sculpture, and he possesses, quote, the chaste perfection of form. Aschenbach contemplates him as a work of art, or as a subject for philosophical speculation about beauty, denying to himself any carnal attraction to the gorgeous boy. Yet, in spite of this enormous pleasure in looking at the boy, Aschenbach soon decides that he's going to have to leave Venice because it's too sultry and filled with evil exhalations from the canals, which are making him sick. And he makes plans to go to some little bathing spot near Trieste. He had already once in the past fled from Venice, and he's very upset that, as he puts it, the conflict between inclination and capacity should have such a big part to play in his abandonment of the city and of the lovely boy. He's very ambivalent about this departure, and he's very happy when his trunk ends up being sent by mistake to Como. And this gives him a great excuse to go back to Venice, saying he has to be at the hotel to wait for its return. And so begins his almost constant observation of Tadzio, to the exclusion of all else, but also his growing awareness that some sickness is spreading in the city and is being kept secret, clearly so as not to frighten away the money-spending tourist. A medicinal smell pervades the city, and there are signs up warning tourists not to eat shellfish or to use the canal waters. One day, Aschenbach reads a German language newspaper, and he learns that it's cholera that has struck. But this dread sickness is being kept hidden to all those who don't know German. His reaction is the apotheosis of his by now mad passion for Tadzio, for, quote, the things that were going on in the unclean alleys of Venice under cover of an official hushing up policy, they gave Aschenbach a dark satisfaction. The city's evil secret mingled with the one in the depths of his heart, and he would have staked all he possessed to keep it, since in his infatuation he cared for nothing but to keep Tadzio here. Now, death and passion are truly united, and there's no turning back for the enslaved Aschenbach. Mann's novella is very beautifully constructed. Every single sentence contributes to its overall meaning and to its culmination in Aschenbach's death on the beach. The city of Venice, in its greed, becomes more and more horrible as the plague of cholera inevitably spreads and hospitals begin to fill up. And there are many, many quotes that I could have given you if time permitted, in which Venice is characterized as evil, smelly, deathly, unmovable in its corrupt cover-up in the name of profit. As was true in 14th century Florence when the Black Plague struck, and that occasioned the writing of another masterpiece of world literature, Boccaccio's Decameron, so in Venice, lawlessness and indecency take over the city, and decent people begin to flee. Aschenbach is corrupted by his own greed, the greed of lust, and he does nothing to warn the Polish boy and his family, instead allowing himself to be turned into a parody of youthful beauty by his barber, who decks him out in dyed hair and makeup, just like the grotesque old man whom Aschenbach had disdained earlier in his journey. Aschenbach is finally released from his enslaving passion only by death. And it's very interesting that this passion that overtook him is very much like the tiger, the jungle tiger at the beginning of the story, for which he felt both terror and longing. And now we know that that tiger was a symbol of deadly carnal passion, which can be neither suppressed nor released without a huge toll. The 1971 film adaptation, which maybe you've seen, by Luchino Visconti, is a visually sumptuous feast. It's a very beautiful film with Dirk Bogarde in the role of Aschenbach, who in fact this time plays a composer very close to the composer Mahler, whose music is played throughout the film. And the young boy, Swedish boy, who plays the Polish Adonis, Bjorn Andresen, was indeed of an unearthly beauty, and so he's just perfect for the part of Tadzio.
two great artists of the 20th century. Thomas Mann, the writer, Luchino Visconti, the filmmaker. Two artists combined to tell the story of an artist.
It's a very fine adaptation of Mann's novella. You can rent it very easily on Amazon Prime or on Netflix. I mean, it just costs a couple of dollars. So if you haven't seen it, I very much recommend that you do. Before looking closely at my next story, Don't Look Now, by Daphne du Maurier, I just want to mention that I discovered that she wrote another Venetian story called Ganymede, which is a kind of redoing of Death in Venice. It's a story of a stuffy teacher of classics who travels to Venice and is captured by a sinister homosexual underworld. This according to the scholar who wrote, Nina Auerbach, who wrote a wonderful book on du Maurier called Haunted Heiress. The story Ganymede's not a great story, but it's an interesting sort of reworking of Death in Venice. However, it's to Don't Look Now that I want to turn because it's very much a superior story. And I should say, by the way, that du Maurier's kind of gotten a bad rap as a writer of light romances, of women's fiction. You know, she's sort of been, in a way, denigrated. And I think that that has a lot to do with her novel Rebecca, which is her most famous book, and even more so, it has to do with the movie by Hitchcock based on Rebecca, which is what many, many people know of du Maurier. And the film is very different from the book, just as his version of The Birds is very different from her story, The Birds. In any case, du Maurier wrote 17 novels, 10 biographies, plays, numerous short stories. And once you start reading her work, it's really hard to see her as simply a writer of light escapist fiction. She's really a complex, powerful, unique writer, as Auerbach puts it. Now, Nicholas Roeg, a wonderful film director, did the adaptation of Don't Look Now to the screen, and he turns it into a kind of love story, a kind of tragic love story, which really isn't what the story is ultimately, the original story. It's more a story of loss.
She was laughing. Yes.
My sister's psychic.
She wants you to know. I've seen her. And she wants you to know that she's happy. Christy.
And so, if you see the movie and you don't read the story, then you get, again, a rather different idea of du Maurier than you would get if you read her actual words. Now, this story is about a couple named John and Laura, and they're on vacation in Venice, and they've gone to the island of Torcello to have lunch and to do some touring about. And while they're in a restaurant, they see two old ladies. And these old ladies become the butt of their joking game, which is something that is very typical for them. They like to make up stories about people that they see seated near them in restaurants or on buses or whatever. And they enjoy imagining that the old ladies are male twins in drag, or criminals, or retired schoolmistresses from Australia named Tilly and Tiny. And John's very pleased that his wife Laura is having so much fun with their game, for he thinks, quote, "If we can pick up the familiar routine of jokes shared on holiday and at home, the ridiculous fantasies about people at other tables, then everything will fall into place. Life will become as it was before. The wound will heal. She will forget. End of quote. So we're left in suspense for a bit about what precisely this wound might be. But we do find out after a couple of pages that they have lost recently their 5-year-old daughter who died of meningitis. And Laura has been seized by what is called numb despair ever since. When she returns, Laura gets up to go to the ladies' room for a minute, and when she comes back, she seems to have been transformed. And it's as if she's in shock or she's in some kind of exalted state. And she tells her husband that one of the old women was in the bathroom too, and told her that the blind sister who had remained at the table had seen their little dead girl, Christine, sitting between them at the table. This amazing news has made Laura extremely happy, and she feels as if a weight has been lifted and she can be at peace. John doesn't believe this for a second, but he doesn't try to convince his wife because he sees that it's made her very happy. When they go to visit the Torcello Cathedral, John sees the sisters again, and he feels, quote, an impending sense of doom, of tragedy. And he thought, this is the end. There's no escape, no future. But this bad sensation disappears when the sisters leave the cathedral, and instead he becomes angry, which tends to be his go-to emotion. And he thinks, how dare those old women try their mediumistic tricks on him, fraudulent and unhealthy as they are. So John and Laura go back to their hotel room. They make love for the first time since their daughter's death, and then they decide it's very late that they're going to go out and look for a little sausage stand where they can grab a bite. But they become lost. And what had seemed like a warm, sheltered little street that they thought they should follow, in the darkness has become altogether different, neglected, poor. The narrow boats moored to the slippery steps of cellar entrances look like coffins. As they proceed, they hear a cry like someone being strangled. But John just says, oh, it's somebody who's drunk. They continue to wander in what is a maze until finally, to their relief, they find a place to go to have a bite to eat. And lo and behold, there are the sisters sitting there at a table across from theirs. Laura insists on going over to say hi and to thank them again. And when she comes back to John, she says, now the sister who has second sight has told them that their little daughter's ghost has told her they must leave Venice, that something terrible is going to happen if they remain. And they also tell her, the sisters tell Laura, that John is in fact psychic, but he doesn't know it. He doesn't pay attention to it. And in fact, when they go back to their hotel, there is a telegram from London saying that their little boy Johnny is in the hospital with appendicitis. So they decide, okay, that's the danger, that's why we have to leave. Now, throughout all of this, meeting the sisters, getting lost, and so on, John is surly, angry, pig-headed. And I find it very interesting in this story. I think it means something that he's the only man in the story that is dominated by feminine presences. There's his wife, there's the ghost of his little girl, there are the two sisters, and there's another mysterious little girl that he had caught a glimpse of jumping across boats when they're lost in their maze, and she plays a role later in the story. And he also is a man who loves Venice, but he doesn't understand it at all. He's flummoxed constantly by the streets and canals. He gets lost very easily. He doesn't know how to order good food. He ends up getting things he doesn't like. So he's really a kind of fish out of water in Venice. His wife decides she will fly back to London, and he's going to follow on a car train. They have their car with them from Milan. But as he is going back to their hotel to pack up, he crosses a ferry and he sees his wife and the two sisters going in the opposite direction. And he is completely astounded by this because his wife should have taken off hours ago. He then begins to go about Venice looking for her, searching for her, going to the police. He ends up getting very drunk. He's just in a tizzy about what this means. Now, you may hate me for this, but I'm not going to tell you the ending of the story because I really want you to read the story. Those of you who have read it, you can reread it, but don't tell your neighbors what the ending is. And those of you who haven't, please, I hope that this has whetted your appetite for reading this rather intensely gripping story. And I really think that it's a story that has to do with giving up on logic. And in some sense, as we know, historically, logic has been associated more with the so-called male realm than the female realm, and intuition and second sight and so on are associated more with women. And I think it's a story that's somehow about that, about how sometimes intuition is best listened to. And I also found it very interesting to discover that du Maurier, who was kind of bisexual, although I don't think she acted on it much, but she always talked about how there was a boy inside of her. And her word, her code word for lesbianism, which for her wasn't just women being sexually attracted to each other, it was a kind of all-woman realm that she was very interested in. Her code name for that was Venice. And for example, she was madly in love with her publisher Doubleday's wife, Ellen, and she wrote letters to Ellen in which she would say that she liked being in a Venetian mood, and she was sorry that there could never be a Venice with Ellen. Now, Rogue's film adaptation is really excellent. It stars Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie as the couple, and it is so beautifully put together. It's so visually stunning. It's really, the movie is much more creepy even than the story. The color red plays a very important role in the film, and I have a friend who once said that he would never see a little red slicker, a rain slicker, again without shivering, because it's very, very creepy in the story, in the film. So I do recommend that you go and see that film. My third book is Ian McEwan's 1981 novel. It was his second novel, called The Comfort of Strangers. I don't know if you've read any Ian McEwan. He's nicknamed Ian Macabre because so many of his books are creepy, in a word. And this book is very much in line with that. Now, I read a lot of reviews of this novel online, both by so-called real critics and readers and postings and so on. And it's a book that really divides people. Some people absolutely hate it and just ridicule it and think it's completely psychologically unbelievable and doesn't have any point, and they just really hate this book. Then there are people on the other side who think that it's gripping, that it's beautifully written, that it does convey something interesting and meaningful. At any rate, the story is again about a couple and eventually about two couples. This time the couple's names are Mary and Colin. And she's a divorced woman with little children, and they've been together for 7 or 8 years, but they've never married. Nonetheless, they're very, very close. And they're on vacation in a city that has to be Venice, given the descriptions of the city, although for whatever reason, McEwan decided never to mention the name of Venice. This is something that annoys some readers, because there's something kind of coy about, why not just say it's Venice? When he talks about the San Marco Square, he talks about the Lido, it's very clear that it's set in Venice, but he doesn't name it. I even see borrowings in McEwan's story from du Maurier's story. I think that he had her story in mind when he wrote his. For example, the fact that in McEwan's story, the husband, Colin, likes to make up stories about people he sees, funny stories, and recount them to his wife, which reminds us of the opening scene in Don't Look Now, when John and Mary are making up stories about the sisters. Also, there's a late night quest to find something to eat, during which they get lost, which is exactly what happens in Don't Look Now. So there are elements that are reminiscent. Something in the setup of the story is very reminiscent. However, in this story, Colin and Mary have not been devastated by a terrible loss. They're slightly bored with each other, but they're very tied to each other, and they just seem like a sort of normal couple on a vacation. One evening, they set forth to look for a place to eat, and they get lost, which is a recurring incident in books about Venice. Venice is the city in which it's most easy to get lost. As anyone who's been there, right, can tell you, it's not easy to find your way around Venice. And being lost is a very interesting state, I think, in narrative, because it allows for a lot of surprises. It allows for the introduction of unexpected characters, of unexpected places, of unexpected events. In Italian, the word for wandering, which is what you do when you're lost, is errare. And errare is etymologically aligned with the word error, mistake. One of the most famous opening passages in world literature is Dante's Divine Comedy, where the pilgrim is lost, right? He finds himself in a dark wood because he's lost the path. He doesn't know where he is. He's both physically and spiritually lost. And another example from Italian literature, which is my specialty, is Ariosto's great Renaissance poem, Orlando Furioso, Mad Orlando. And there, the knight goes off the path of the right because he's in the grips of mad passion, and he ends up losing his mind completely in the process. So there are numerous examples of people getting lost. And getting lost represents sin, loss of reason, danger. Those who don't know where they're going or how to get there obviously are in danger, both physical and psychological. Now, the surprise that awaits this couple, Colin and Mary, is a man. He just surges up as they're going along a little street. And he's described as a squat figure who says to them, "Are you tourists?" "Yes, of course you are." Mary says immediately that they're looking for a place to eat. But Colin sidles by the man, and he murmurs to Mary, saying, "We don't need to explain ourselves to him." The man catches Colin by the wrist and says that he knows of an excellent place for them to eat. So there's already something menacing about this fellow. He holds on to Colin's wrist in an unremitting way, which is not normal behavior between two strangers. And the description of this man does nothing to inspire confidence. He's wearing a tight-fitting, silky black shirt, unbuttoned almost to the waist, and an imitation gold razor blade on a chain that's slightly askew on the thick pelt of his chest hair. Now, we know that a razor blade on a necklace is what drug dealers wear. And all in all, with his hairy appearance and his cloyingly sweet cologne and his unbuttoned shirt, he sounds like a proper gangster, a mafia type. Nonetheless, our couple go along with him. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that a lot of readers and critics say, hey, there's no psychological realism here at all. What tourist would go along with a fellow who looked like that and who acted like that, who was so aggressive? But they do go along, and they end up in a crowded, smoky bar, which is entirely filled with men. And in spite of the kind of broken down, smelly atmosphere, they begin to experience what Ian McEwan calls the pleasure of finding themselves in a place without tourists, of making a discovery, finding somewhere real. We may wonder why Colin and Mary trust this particular stranger, but it's clear that they begin to do so. And Robert settles in, name of the fellow, and recounts to them the story of his tyrannical diplomat father and his vindictive sisters. And it's a long, convoluted story which is really quite sordid and ugly. He clearly comes from a very dysfunctional family, which might very well explain his own quite non-standard behavior with the tourist couple. He continues to touch Colin and Mary. He winks and leers at them. There's something decidedly creepy about the entire encounter. When Colin and Mary take leave of Robert, it's extremely late and very dark, and they again become hopelessly lost. They end up sleeping outside, propping each other up on a step. When they wake up, Mary is completely parched and desperately in need of water. But as the streets wake up and fill with people, they figure out where they are, and they find themselves once more in the Piazza San Marco. There they sit down, waiting to get some water from a tourist who's totally ignoring them. And when he finally comes and asks what they want and they say water, he just blows them off. He says, "There's a fountain over there, go help yourself." But as they're sitting there, Mary comments to Colin that this city for her has become terribly suffocating, oppressive, like a prison. And she suggests that they should just leave. They have 10 more days of their vacation. She says, "Let's get out of here." As they're sitting there, slumped down, exhausted, thirsty, they spy a man from the back in a white suit with a cigarette in one hand and a camera in the other, and sure enough, it's Robert, who sees them and runs over exclaiming, "My friends, my friends." They tell him about their miserable night, and he says it's all his fault. He should never have let them go off alone from the restaurant, and he insists that they come back to his house to rest. And they do so. And this is the second time when you might say to yourself, why in heaven's name are they continuing to involve themselves with this very unsavory person? When they go to the house, it turns out to be a luxurious palazzo that's filled with antiques and all kinds of memorabilia of his father and of his grandfather. And as the women go in the kitchen to prepare lunch, Robert begins to lecture Colin about how men should dominate the world. They should dominate women, first of all, but the world secondarily. And Colin then rather sarcastically remarks that Robert's home is then a museum dedicated to the good old days of patriarchy. And he just says this in a kind of offhand, sarcastic way, and there's a real moment of tremendous shock when Robert's reaction is to punch him hard in the stomach, and so hard that Colin falls to the floor, crumples to the floor. Robert helps him up and turns to go in and see what's doing in the kitchen, and as he goes, he looks back at Colin and winks at him. Nonetheless, the couple stay for dinner. You would think at that point they'd say, basta. And they have an okay dinner, but as the wife introduces herself, of course, her name's Carolyn, and she's obviously, there's something wrong with her. She has some kind of defect or injury. She shows a lot of pain when she moves, when she sits. And as they are leaving, she whispers to them that they must promise to return, and that she is unable to get downstairs and to get out of this place. She says that it's like a prison for her. There are more twists and turns to this decidedly creepy, or depending on your perspective, rather unbelievable story. And I won't go into them again. I'll leave you suspended. What I will say is that sadomasochistic sex and a total obsession with Colin play a very big part in the subsequent developments. So here again we have a story set in a place that's clearly Venice, in which there is an aura of menace, this time of a kind of sick erotic menace. And loss, being lost, plays a very big role. There's a movie also based on this, directed by Paul Schrader, and the screenplay is by Harold Pinter, and it stars Christopher Walken as Robert, who's very good in the role because Christopher Walken is just naturally bizarre. But he doesn't look anything like the Robert of the book, of course. He's not squat and dark. He's a tall, rather light-haired man. Helen Mirren plays his wife Carolyn, Natasha Richardson plays Mary, and Rupert Everett plays Colin. And what a pedigree for a film, right? I mean, all really excellent creative people. And the movie, I think, is good. It uses Venice very well. Venice is both sumptuous and somehow menacing. And so I think that Schrader gets that right. But it is a little bit kitschy. On the other hand, I think it's worth seeing.
Colin and Mary have returned to Venice in search of romance. Desire takes them on a journey, sensual and mysterious. Love and madness become one. Nothing is as it seems.
Good evening.
There is no separating tenderness and terror. The comfort of strangers.
Finally, to end my chat with you, I'll talk very briefly about the last book, which is in fact where the idea for this talk came from. It's Patricia Highsmith's 1967 novel, Those Who Walk Away. I have a long-standing interest in and love for Patricia Highsmith's works, and there's an almost finished book manuscript sitting in my drawer at home on Patricia Highsmith that I hope someday to return to, and perhaps it'll see the light of day. She is best known for her early novel, Strangers on a Train, which was, of course, made into a film by Hitchcock, and by her novels about the talented Mr. Ripley, who is con man supreme. Highsmith was born in Texas and educated at Barnard in New York, but she moved as a young adult to Europe, and she lived most of her life in Switzerland. She did visit Italy many times, and it's interesting that Italy is a setting for many stories and books. And Those Who Walk Away is set in Venice. This is a novel that's received very little critical attention. Even people who write on Highsmith don't talk much about this book. So I think it warrants some attention. I think actually, in the end, it's a kind of absurdist novel. It's what I think it is. It's a novel that is like a maze and is about people being lost in the maze of Venice, but the story is also maze-like, with no clear conclusion. The story has to do with two men who are locked in an obsessive, dangerous relationship with each other. And this is a classic setup for a Patricia Highsmith novel. We see it in Strangers on a Train. We see it in Mr. Ripley with his friend Greenleaf, Dickie Greenleaf. We see it in any number of her novels. Now, these people, Ray, a young American art dealer, and Ed, his brutish father-in-law, are tied to one another because Peggy, Ed's daughter and Ray's wife, has committed suicide. And Ed is absolutely bound and determined to hold Ray responsible for her death. And Ray is vacillating within himself because he can't figure out why she died. They were essentially on their honeymoon. And yet he feels some sense of responsibility. He just can't put a name to it. So Ed and Ray Ray and Peggy had been in Mallorca. Ed goes to Mallorca when Peggy dies, and then Ed and Ray travel back to Italy together, and they first go to Rome. And there, Ed just pulls out a gun and tries to shoot Ray on the street. They're just standing there, and he decides, he's so furious with Ray that he tries to kill him, and he runs away. As soon as he shoots the gun, Ed runs away, and he has no idea if he's killed Ray or not. Ed then escapes, goes off to Venice, and Ray is not dead, and he follows Ed to Venice. And this is where this cat and mouse game begins. And of course, it's a perfect city for a cat and mouse game because it's like a labyrinth. As we've said already, it's so easy to get lost in Venice. And it's disorienting, even to the most level-headed of visitors. Ed tries once more to kill his son-in-law Ray by pushing him out of a boat as they're returning to Venice from the Lido, where they had met for dinner. And Ed is absolutely convinced that Ray's dead this time. And Ray decides, okay, I'll hide out and I'll pretend I'm dead. And then we'll see what Ed does. And this is a kind of upping of the stakes of this rather sick game between them. What's really interesting also about the novel is the contrast between Ed and Ray's absolutely obsessive focusing on one another in a very unhealthy way, and the people in Venice who help them to hide. And these people are painted as perfectly normal, lovely, generous people, like the bar girl, Elisabetta, who finds Ray a place to hide, or one of the gondoliers who pulls Ray out of the canal after his father-in-law has thrown him in. And these people are painted as really lovely, kind people. And I think it's in that contrast that we understand even more how absolutely aberrant the behavior of Ed and Ray really is. Near the end of the book, and now at the end of my talk, Ray finally comes to the realization that he and Ed have been playing a futile game. He says, Ray had an oppressive realization that one person looking on foot was an absurdity in Venice. This little start of a maze in which he stood at La Fenice was duplicated 200, 300 times all over the city of Venice. End of quote. Nonetheless, Ray continues to zigzag about, as Highsmith says. And zigzag, I think, is a perfect word for going about in Venice. It means twisty, meandering, crooked. And this is what it's like to walk in Venice. And in the case of this novel, it's also the way in which these two men are attached in a twisty and crooked way. The novel ends in a draw. Neither man succeeds in either killing or forgiving the other. They leave Venice behind and move on into futures that are left completely unclear. And so, like Ray and Ed, we now leave Venice behind too. I hope you've been inspired to read some or all of these stories of creepy Venice and to find for yourselves other dark tales set in the Queen of the Adriatic. Thanks a lot. And there's a few, minutes left if you have some comments or things you'd like to add. Yeah, I'm sorry. He was asking if there were other cities that were used, for many books. And I was just saying that, you think of all the big capitals and there are lots of books set in them. And then Rosalie was just saying that London is maze-like too. It has that quality. Yeah. I mean, Venice is particularly maze-like. For those of you who've been there, it really is. It's so easy to get lost there because the streets are not marked terribly well. They don't follow any kind of city grid, so it's a good city for sort of scary stories. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment.
Jubilant stories about Venice?
Yeah, joyous and upbeat
Not many that I know of. I mean, there are novels that, have something to do with carnival. I guess, you could say that that's kind of a fun time. Although there's also something slightly, frightening about carnival too, because everybody's masked and people get into trouble, during carnival. So, I don't know. I mean, Coover's Pinocchio in Venice is pretty darn funny. I recommend that novel. It's Pinocchio transformed into a character who lives and is a professor in Venice, and he's slowly turning back into a stick of wood. But it's a very funny novel. So I guess that one. I can't think of others. Yeah. To me, it does. I don't want to push that. I don't want to do a big feminist reading, of these stories. But certainly in Don't Look Now, I really see that. That poor fellow John. He's the logical. He wants to stick to logic. He wants to, go forging straight ahead. And he's got all of these womanly qualities floating around him, intuition and second sight and so on, and he can't hook into it, he kind of gets it in the end, but alas, too late. So, but I think it's true. I mean, so many stories about Venice just say explicitly that it's a she, it's the Serenissima. Well, it's a città, it's a city, but nonetheless, it's very much a feminine place, seen as a feminine place. Well, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed talking with you.